This is Life's Tough, but Explorers Are Tougher. I'm your host, Richard Wiese. I love the outdoors. I always have, and I always will. I've heard stories that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Explorers are the type of people who walk in space, go to the bottom of the ocean, and stand on the highest summits. Scratch the surface of any explorer, and you'll find they're all storytellers. This show is about their tales. I'm going to give you the setting. It is March of 1999, and balloonist Brian Jones and Bertrand Piccard are on the front page of almost every newspaper in the world for their historic first nonstop balloon flight around the world. They immediately jet from Egypt to New York City and the Explorers Club annual dinner, which is the most important gathering of world-class explorers every year. Much to the delight of 1,200 guests, including Buzz Aldrin, Sylvia Earle, and Don Walsh, Bertrand Piccard and Brian Jones step out onto the stage to a massive balloon drop. Bertrand, do you remember that day?
How can I forget that? It was incredible. We've been 20 days alone in the capsule, and suddenly we were with 1,200 friends from the Explorers Club. That was magical.
I think that might have been the first time I've met you as well. And just to give our audience a little background of why I thought that's, metaphorically stepping on the stage was so important. You come from a very unique background of explorers. I know plenty of second generation explorers. I don't know three generations. So your grandfather's name was Auguste, and Jacques Piccard was your father, who Don Walsh had his historic first trip to the bottom of the ocean. So there had to be a sense of relief for you that now you were stepping onto the same level as your grandfather and your father.
Yes, and for the anecdote, I can show you on the screen the Explorers Club card, membership card from my grandfather and from my father. So I had the Explorers Club all my childhood in front of me, and their medals of the Explorers Club also. And I was dreaming of being an explorer, but it's difficult to be an explorer when you dream about it just the month that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin put their foot on the moon, because I had the impression everything had been explored. So I started to just be open to everything that was new, everything that had not been made, and going from hang gliding to microlight to crossing the Atlantic in a balloon. Suddenly I was in these flights to go around the world nonstop in a balloon. That was my ultimate dream. It was 6 years of my life to prepare it. And this success, exactly as you said, Richard, this success was for me a fulfillment. I was finally in the world of explorers, where so many of them had inspired me to embrace the unknown, to go for the doubts, to go for the question marks, to go for everything that hadn't been done.
So your father just two decades in the 1960s with Don Walsh were the first to the bottom of the ocean, to the Mariana Trench. So your father, I believe, was alive when you landed on that balloon flight.
Yes.
And do you remember the first conversation you had with him?
Yes, my father was a fantastic explorer. He went to the Mariana Trench. He built 5 submarines to explore the oceans and the lakes. But nevertheless, he was a very, very protective father. And during the flight I did around the world, he was very, very anxious. And I remember he sent me an email to the Breitling orbiter balloon, and I read it in the capsule the day before landing. And he told me, of course, congratulations, you're going to succeed, it's fantastic, but don't forget to bend your knees when you touch down. It is so amazing, because of course, I would bend my knees. Of course, when you land with a balloon, you have to be careful. But he needed to give me this piece of advice to feel better. It was really touching.
You know, it's funny the conversations that you have even during historic moments. I recently asked one of Neil Armstrong's sons, when you first came to the quarantine area and saw your father, what's the first thing he said to you? And he said to me and my brother, "Have you guys been mowing the lawn?"
Yes, because for us in the family, exploration is normal. So we always speak of everything else. But it was touching. My father welcomed me after the flight around the world with a Breitling hat, and in the back it was written 1884, which was the year Breitling was founded, but it was also the year my grandfather was born. So in that sense, my father was wearing a hat where there was the birth date of my grandfather, and the three generations in this way were reunited.
I'm always kind of curious of those moments, because you had to know that the world was watching. And so you share something very intimate with Brian Jones, right? You had been together for 20 hours, 20 days in a very cramped capsule. And so before you land, it's sort of like the calm before the land. Is it something that made you guys anxious? Is it one of those things like, here we go? You know, what was that conversation, the hours before you were going to land?
Well, the proof of the success, that was the day before the landing when we crossed the finish line over Mauritania. And there we fell in the arms of each other, we hugged each other, we cheered, and then we looked at each other and said, okay, we succeeded, but we still have to fly this balloon and we still had 24 hours to go. So then it was only concentration to land correctly, and we could really celebrate once we've landed.
You know, you mentioned the background of your father and that you grew up with exploration. So you and I are about the same age, and I grew up watching the Apollo missions. Right, I would cut out newspapers. I would watch on television. I'd use any excuse to stay from home from school if there was a launch that day. And you were a little different. Instead of just the newspapers, you had actually met some of the Apollo astronauts and were to some of the launches. Am I correct on that?
I was very fortunate. I was between 10 and 12 years old, living in Florida, close to Cape Canaveral. My father was a friend of Wernher von Braun, and he had just built a submarine for Grumman Aerospace, who was building the lunar module. So I was invited with my father and my mother for every liftoff, Apollo 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, absolutely incredible. And the evening before, there was always a big cocktail where all of the previous astronauts were attending and some other heroes of exploration. And in these cocktails, I met Charles Lindbergh. I met all the right stuff astronauts, from Mercury, from Gemini, the early Apollo astronauts. And I was there just dreaming of exploration and dreaming of having this type of life. And these people really gave me the taste for exploration. I owe them so much because they were taking care of the little boy who was looking at them with big eyes and asking them naive questions. And they were so human, they were not supermen. They were normal people speaking in a normal way, but completely passionate, completely dedicated to what they were doing. And this gave me a fantastic view of what exploration could be.
It's interesting because I have a little bit of an analogous situation with my own children, who you have met. Last year, you and I attended the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing, and we had 8 Apollo astronauts, including Buzz Aldrin. And so these were men that you watched as a 10 or 11-year-old, and my boys are the same age meeting them. And you mentioned the humanity of the astronauts because I noticed in the sea of fans, and let's face it, when you're at the Explorers Club, that's the the top, the pantheon, the top of the pyramid of explorers, the Apollo astronauts. Yet I noticed they gravitated towards the kids because I think that they almost felt that they had to earn their admiration or tell a funny joke or be the cool kind of uncle than everyone else who just wants to talk to them about the same subject over and over again. So it was interesting seeing these astronauts talking to my children. So, um, but I don't think they quite have the perspective yet of maybe years from now they'll say, "Wow, I met the first guys who walked on the moon." So, I'm sure it took a little time before you realized how special those moments were.
But your children are very fortunate to be born in that environment, because I give you another anecdote with children. I was in Portugal walking together with Neil Armstrong. We were giving a prize in a big event together. And in front of us, there was a man I did not know who was walking about 10 meters in front of us. And all the hundreds of children, they were cheering at him. They wanted to touch him. They wanted to take pictures of him. And I asked to the organizer, but who is that? And they said, it's Cristiano Ronaldo, the football player. And I told to the organizer, you know what? If the children are cheering at a football player and ignoring the first man on the moon, the world is finished. And I was completely depressed.
I think everything is relative because, for example, Charles Lindbergh, the first man to sail the Atlantic Ocean in the 1920s and 30s, was probably the most recognizable person in the world, right? Everybody knew who he was.
Yes, absolutely.
But if you ask most kids today, or even adults, young adults, who he is, I bet you, only 20% of Americans know who Charles Lindbergh is. I don't know that number, but I'm just saying, you know, people or celebrity tends to be very relative to the time in which you grow up.
But this is why the Explorers Club is so important. You need the Explorers Club to cultivate the memory of all these fantastic pioneers, because these are the role models we should have. These people have really achieved something absolutely extraordinary. They have opened new ways to think, to do, to travel, to so important. And we need to keep these role models alive in the mind of the children. So this is a program the Explorers Club should do, is really to educate about exploration, but educate about the pioneers who made exploration so beautiful.
So you could have kind of called it a day after that balloon flight and said, you know what? I have achieved a really important historic first, and that I will forever be known as the first guy or first couple that went nonstop. But yet you didn't. You started your next project, Solar Impulse, and that was a monumental undertaking about now using technology to prove something, prove a proof of concept of something that would better the world. So, how did Solar Impulse? This is the first solar powered flight around the world. How did that start?
Because a success should never be an end in itself. It's not a goal, it's only a step you walk on to have more credibility and more potential to do something else, to do something even better. And if Breitling orbiter balloon flight around the world was for me a personal dream, I also wanted to do something that was clearly useful for humankind. And I wanted to show that you can fly around the world without fuel, thanks to clean technologies and using renewable energies, and show that it's possible when everybody says it's impossible.
I think I was at JFK Airport in New York during one of your legs of landing. I remember that, and you always seemed to be in good spirits, but these flights have got to be draining. And for people who don't know, your background is actually in psychiatry, and so How has that helped you in the dynamics of those flights, moving forward ideas, helping you through difficult situations? I know you've mentioned once to me that you even do self-hypnosis to fall asleep.
Yes, that's true. In the air, I was using self-hypnosis to be able to sleep in short periods of 20 minutes. And sometimes I was using self-hypnosis to stay awake. So exactly the opposite. Instead of breathing out very deeply, was breathing in very deeply to accumulate energy and stay awake when I was tired. But it was interesting to see that the flights were always so fascinating. I enjoyed so much that it was never difficult to cope with. I just loved it. What was extremely difficult in this project was all the time on the ground, not in the air. Because on the ground, we had to deal with administration, bureaucracy, security measures, technology, weather constraints. And that was terrible. You know, probably one out of 2 or 3 flights was postponed each time. So you sit in the cockpit and you get out of the cockpit and you cannot take off. So it was very difficult. And probably what I learned a lot was resilience. It's really the word I needed to implement in my daily life. In every crisis, in every problem, you know, you always need to see which is the new tool that you have to build in order to be better after than before. And in Solar Impulse, it was clearly resilience.
You know, speaking of resilience, you and I have spoken about the pandemic several times. And I think you said to me once that the goal behind any crisis is to come out of that crisis better than when you started. So, what's your advice on this current pandemic? Because people are, have got to be calling in question their very existence. What does this all mean? If there is any advice to give on that, what is it?
You need to remember that a crisis that you accept becomes an adventure. And an adventure that you refuse will remain a crisis. This is something really important because we are not responsible of what life is bringing us, but we are responsible individually of what we're doing with it. So what are we going to learn? What are we going to understand? And sometimes what we have to learn is resilience, acceptation. We have to accept that we are part of a bigger system of the world where there are bacteria, viruses, problems, wars, injustice, and maybe our role is to try to make all this work better. So this is why I say that exploration today is not so much about discovering new territories anymore, because we've discovered everything, including the moon. But now it's about making a better quality of life on Earth. And for this, we need to explore different ways of thinking, different ways of doing, different ways to make relations between human beings and nature, or human beings to human beings also between themselves. So there is so much to learn in order to make our life worth being lived on this planet.
Bertrand, that sort of leads perfectly into your next sort of exploration, or what you're working on now, is the idea of making the world a better place.
Yes, because with the Solar Impulse Foundation now we are working on something very down to earth, I would say, very practical, which is identifying in the world 1,000 technological solutions that can protect the environment, but in a financially profitable way, in order to be able to get the interest of heads of states, governments, big corporations, big institutions, and give them the tools they need to have much more ambitious and effective energy policies, environmental targets, and so on.
Bertrand, we just have about 5 minutes left, but I do have some questions I want to ask you, because you have been in the unique position of really meeting virtually every great explorer of the 20th century, at least in the second half of the 20th century, of those right stuff astronauts and Apollo people and people who've gone to the bottom, who are the explorers that have impressed you the most? The ones that, you know, you thought, wow, this guy is really got everything going for him. Is there anybody in particular?
Well, Charles Lindbergh impressed me very much when I met him.
What
Edmund Hillary,
about him? What did you find interesting about him?
his charisma. You know, he was a living legend, and he was there, very tall, white hair, talking to me when I was 11 years old. And I thought, wow, this guy is just a human being. And I found that with other big explorers, big astronauts. I like Wally Schirra very much, Scott Carpenter very much. You know, Scott Carpenter came for my 12th birthday in 1970 in California. And years later, yeah, 30 years later, I gave a speech about the balloon flight around the world. And an old man came to me after my speech and said, "Do you remember me? I'm Scott Carpenter." And I said,
Yeah, I think I'll remember you.
Of course I remember you. How can I forget you? Impossible. And you know, these people were just so touching. And of course, Neil Armstrong. I was a friend of Neil Armstrong because we never spoke about the moon. You know, I understood that if you speak about the moon, you are like everybody else, and you're going to make him fed up. So we're speaking of everything else. And
You know, it's funny you mentioned sort of Scott Carpenter, because one of the things I find most interesting when two explorers get together is we sort of trade stories. So I spent a week and a half in the Moroccan desert with Scott Carpenter. We were going to this gathering of nomadic Arabs in the desert called Tantan. We were meeting the king of Morocco. And so he was telling the king of Morocco that he had landed very far off course on his landing. You remember that? He said, but some Russian guy landed even further. And I said to him, Scott, the only difference is that guy was defecting. And so we laughed. You know, it's you also mentioned Neil Armstrong, and again, just dropping names back and forth. I think you know Peter Hillary, Sir Edmund Hillary's son. He
yes,
said that he once went to the North Pole with his father, Ed Hillary, the first guy in Everest, and Neil Armstrong. And I said that, you know, what did they talk about? And he said, you know, his father, Ed Hillary, was so interested on so many things about the moon, but he said Neil Armstrong never once really asked him about Everest. And so I think that when I look at these two types of explorers, if you're a mountain climber, you're probably a mountain guide, which means you're sort of entertaining or getting along with people. And the astronauts were very singularly focused on their mission and not really the external. So there you have very different personalities, obviously a lot of respect for each other. And he had wonderful things to say about Neil Armstrong as well.
yes. But you know why I liked Scott Carpenter so much? If he landed very far off his course in the middle of the ocean instead of close to the airship carrier, it's because he enjoyed his flight. He described it very well. He just enjoyed it. He was telling on the radio how beautiful it was, how great he was feeling up there. And he was a bit distracted and did not land at the right place. And I think this is so great because he was not a machine, he was not a robot. He just was a big heart enjoying what he was saying from up there.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting if you ask Buzz Aldrin, you knew Neil Armstrong, I'd only met him, but when you ask those guys to emotionalize their landing experience, they were very much mission focused, and I don't think they ever took the time to internalize what was going on. They would say, you know, we had a checklist. I didn't really bring emotion into it. They may have shook hands or did something, but I think that you're right. Sat Carpenter's emotional response to his flight was a lot different than the guys on Apollo 11.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But there
So
were
I,
explorers who became good friends. It's like Richard Branson, Steve Fossett. We were very friendly rivals when we were trying to fly around the world nonstop in a balloon. And we kept always this friendship together. And it was sad that Steve Fossett died so early with this airplane accident.
Yeah.
He was he was very, very impressive. You know, he could do everything in every field. In the mountain, underwater, in a sailboat, in a balloon, in an airplane. He was so polyvalent. And I really admired Steve Fossett. And now there is Victor Vescovo, who is doing a bit the same, except that he has been back to the Mariana Trench, which was great. He went to see the place my father and Don Walsh have put the Baptist Cave in 1960. But he's also a mountaineer. So Victor is also very impressive in all the different fields that he's active on.
Yeah, he's a very impressive guy. It's interesting you mention him because before this interview, I was just talking to some friends who are not involved in science or exploration. And I said to them, who are the greatest explorers of the 20th century? And they said, Neil Armstrong, the Apollo 11. I don't think you get that much argument. And so I said, who do you think is the greatest explorer of the 21st century? And one of them jokingly said, I think it's Captain Piccard from Star Trek. Now, there is something that is very familiar with that story to you because I believe it was, 1986, the creator of Star Trek chose to call him Captain Piccard, but I believe they dropped one of the C's.
Yes, they made the spelling a little bit different because the story was inspired, of the personage, the person of Captain Piccard was inspired by the twin brother of my grandfather, Jean Piccard. And the author of Star Trek was afraid to be sued by my family if he was spelling exactly the same. We would never have sued him. Of course not. It would have been great to have the same spelling. But nevertheless, it comes from the twin brother of my grandfather. And it's very funny because he's in the future. So in that sense, he's maybe my grandson.
So you have 3 children. I've met them. You and your wife have done an absolute marvelous job. I have 3 children. I hope my children turn out as well as your children. But
But they're wonderful. I like your children very much, Richard. They are so open to the world. So they have such a awareness of what is happening. It's great.
Yeah, and we have our little battles right now. My daughter is not enjoying a few of her classes, and so we have the typical. She's 12, about to turn into a teenager, so she's starting to have a few battles with my wife, Nikki. But is there pressure within the Piccard family that you've got to be an explorer now? I mean, 3 generations. It feels like. Is there an end of the road? Does it matter? I know you probably want what's best for your children.
My father never pushed me to be an explorer. He said, do what you want, but do it well. And it's exactly what I did with my children. I have 3 daughters. I told them, do what you want, but do it with a pioneering spirit. Don't do exactly what other people are doing. Just look how you can think differently, how you can behave differently, what you can invent in whatever you do and in whatever you are. And I think it worked. They are fulfilled in their life. They are very active, very open, very responsible of what they are doing, very aware about protection of the environment. So they are explorers of life, if not explorers of the moon or the underwater.
You know, as much as I have enjoyed when I first met you at that balloon drop after the Breitling orbiter flight, and as much as I enjoyed being at JFK when the Solar Impulse landed, to me, the most joyous and memorable moment with you is having dinner in your kitchen in Switzerland at your home with your daughters and their boyfriends and your wife. To me, that spoke much greater volumes about who you are as a man and what you value. So, Bertrand, I thank you for being an explorer, but I also thank you more for being a human. And I cherish our friendship, and I think the world is a better place for having a Bertrand Piccard in it. So thank you for being on Life's Tough, but Explorers Are Tougher.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for leading the Explorers Club and perpetuating this example of the spirit of exploration.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Richard.
All right, you're welcome.